In this movie, we're going to talk about rendering, which is the creation of temporary video and audio files for parts of your project that Final Cut can't absolutely guarantee will play back in real time at high quality. If you take a look in the 9.13 render project, we have several areas within this sequence that indicate that they need to be rendered. These dotted lines here are the render indicators. So in other words, you'll see these dotted lines when you're working with video or effects that quote-unquote need to be rendered. But let's talk about this a little bit. Rendering isn't always necessary by any means. Many effects play back just fine in real time. That is, they don't have to be rendered. But then again, sometimes rendering is necessary. It really depends on your system, the media being used, as well as how complex the elements in the timeline are. As you can see for this one here, this clip just has a very simple rescaling applied to it, and it plays back in real time just fine. Same thing with this basic Ken Burns zoom. We have the render indicators, but it plays back fine. This stack of clips, however, I've really done a number on. So we have 4 streams of video playing back simultaneously, and on each of these clips, I've applied many effects. So if I play this back, we may struggle. That hiccup just a little bit, but not too bad. It just blew through 4 streams of video and about 30 effects without much problem. But again, it took all of that to drop even a few frames because I have a really robust system. So long story short, we would likely need to render this effect stack to make sure it plays back smoothly. So there are a couple of approaches when it comes to rendering. First, Final Cut Pro X contains a feature called background rendering. This simply means that if you stop moving the cursor in the area of the timeline that needs to be rendered, Final Cut will begin rendering any applicable video or audio effects in the background so that you can continue working elsewhere. It even does this if you switch to another application and begin working. Final Cut's default background render time is set in Preferences. So I'll go to Final Cut Pro, Preferences, and then I come to Playback and Rendering. Now I have this off right now, but as you can see, the default background render time for Final Cut is 5 seconds. Now personally, I think this timing is a little short. That's because if I'm designing titles or effects, and I'm still in the process of creating them, or even just trying something out, and I stop working for 5 seconds, then Final Cut is going to begin rendering. This can be kind of wasteful, since it may render effects that you won't actually be using in your finished sequence if you're not done with them. Not to mention, we just said that not all effects need to be rendered, so you might be wasting valuable processor power and drive space. So at any rate, you may want to bump this number up a little bit, 60 or 90 seconds, to give yourself a minute or a minute and a half before things start to render. Or if you want more control, you can always just turn background rendering off, like I do, and manually render each time you need to see a result. But just to show you this, I will turn it on, and I'm going to bring this down to maybe about 2 seconds and show you how this works. So take a look at our render indicator lines. They should start to go away as background rendering starts to occur. You can see that they're disappearing here, and if you want to take a look at exactly what's happening, you can simply open up your background tasks window. As you can see, we're rendering away. For now, though, I'll turn off background rendering because I want to talk about how to manually trigger a render, which is how I like to work. I'll close this, and then I'm going to come up to my Modify menu. There are 2 manual render settings, Render All and Render Selection. Render Selection is going to render anything that I've got selected in my sequence, whereas Render All is going to render anything that needs rendering in the timeline. So you'll certainly need to use these 2 manual options if you've turned off background rendering or if you want to trigger a render before the background render starts. So I'll show you this. I've just got a little bit of the last part of this clip that still has a render indicator. And even though we've already talked about how we wouldn't need to render this Ken Burns zoom, I just want to show you how to trigger a render. I'll go ahead and choose Render Selection, Control R, by selecting this clip and pressing Control R. And now you see that my render indicators are going away as it renders this clip. So rendering is an important part of the editing process, and it's important that you make some decisions about this in order to streamline your workflow and maximize your processing power and minimize your wasted drive space. Also, just to reiterate, in this movie, we talked primarily about executing renders. Later in the course, when we discuss media management, we'll talk about deleting used and unused render files.